Welcome to Garden DC, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 130 of the Garden DC podcast. In this episode, we talk with Gary Lewis of Phoenix Perennials and Specialty Plants all about ground covers. The plant profile is on amaryllis, and we share what's going on in the garden as well as some upcoming local gardening events in the What's New segment. We close out with garden communicator Carol J. Michael, who shares the last word on 5 daily gardening tips. This episode, we're joined by Gary Lewis. He is the owner of Phoenix Perennials and the author of The Complete Book of Ground Covers. Welcome, Gary.
Thanks, Kathy. Pleasure to be on.
Great to have you on. And so we should start off by saying the topic of this episode is ground covers, and you have a brand new book on that topic, and I have one coming out soon. But you are one of our few guests, Gary, that are not from the Mid-Atlantic area. So I'd like you to tell listeners first a bit about where you're located and your growing zone.
Okay. Well, I am from Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. And we have a gardening climate very much like Seattle, so we're pretty mild. I'm zone 8B where I am. And, it's kind of God's country in terms of growing perennials because we can do all of, pretty much everything. And then we can get into some kind of fun zonal denial type plants as well and have a good time with those. But I did grow up in Ontario, which is closer to your neck of the woods, kind of zone 5B territory. So I have a little bit of familiarity with continental gardening and a little bit more East Coast gardening as well.
Excellent. And it's so funny to think how much farther north you are than most of our listeners, but that you are pretty much a zone higher than most of us.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. And actually, if you go all the way up the coast of British Columbia and you get into the Alaska Panhandle, they're actually really mild up there too. So you can get into, I'm not sure what the zones are in the Alaska Panhandle, but I guess it could be zone 7, zone 8. So different kinds of climates. So of course our climate here is zone, 8B, except, it's different than a zone 7 or 8 in the Carolinas. We have a modified Mediterranean climate here, so it's kind of an extension of California in that we have mild, wet winters that stay kind of cool. We get snow from time to time, but not often. And then we have really quite dry summers with a fair bit of summer drought. So it's a little bit different than, say, the Carolinas, where you might be zone 7 or maybe zone 8, but you're warming up during the day a little bit and then kind of getting a little bit cold at night.
Mm-hmm. And definitely different, as you said, rainfall patterns, whereas we can have, deluges in the summertime and pretty wet conditions on and off. And there's also a day length difference.
Yeah, certainly. And at this time of year, as we're getting into winter time, our days are very short up here in the north.
Mm-hmm. I know. I'm feeling the short days here already, Gary. feeling sorry for myself already that it's already dark at 4:45 or 5 p.m.
I try to think of it as cozy time. It's the cozy. I don't. Fall is beautiful, and I envy you guys back in the East because one of the things I love so much about Eastern North America is the fall color, and we don't have that out here on the West Coast. We've just got conifers. So I envy you guys for that fall color, but the rest of kind of fall makes me feel melancholy. But I've been trying to change my thinking around that in the last few years and think of it as cozy time. It's time to settle in for a nice cozy winter.
Mm-hmm. And so we like to ask on the Garden DC podcast about baby Gary, and were you born with chlorophyll in your veins and a green thumb?
I think I probably was actually. I don't know how I got into gardening, but it probably is genetic or something. There's a photo of me at 6 months old sitting on my grandmother's lap, and she was a gardener, and had a lot liked to plant her annuals, liked her house plants, and I'm sitting there on her lap, and there is a tropical hibiscus in a pot out in the garden, but she's got it outside in the summertime, and it's a big, huge, blooming red tropical hibiscus, and I am reaching out for it. I'm not paying attention to the camera. I'm not paying attention to anybody else, but I'm reaching out for that big, colorful red flower right beside me. So that could have been the start of it at 6 months old, or some of my earlier memories from the ages of 3, 4, 5, 6 are um, walking through the fields and forests of my childhood. I lived in Germany when I was quite young, and then in Nova Scotia when I was a little younger or a little bit older, and then Ontario after that. And I would seek out my fields and forests, and I would pick flowers for my mother. So it could have been, the positive reinforcement of wanting to make my mom happy, and coming home with a bouquet of flowers from that I had found while out foraging for her. So I don't know. I've been into plants for a long time. I started collecting houseplants when I was 10. At the age of 16, I started working in a wholesale nursery on weekends back in Ontario. And it was that year that my Aunt Jean came over with a rototiller. Aunt Jean is the handy aunt, and she rototilled the whole front yard. And then I planted a perennial garden in my mom's front yard, which she still has to this day. I've left her with it to take care of. So, yeah, I think I've been into plants for since the very beginning. So that's the baby Gary story.
And you've grown up and you have your own perennial business. And is that open to the public or wholesale only?
So we're open to the public. So we're a retail grower. So we're a retail garden center nursery where we grow a very large portion of our own plants. And we also do mail order across Canada. So we offer about 5,000 different plants a year, which is kind of crazy, but it's fun, keeps me interested. We import different plants from all over the world, from Europe, from India and Japan and South Africa, and from all across the US as well, and a little bit in Canada. So we bring in plants from all over the place and grow them on, and then offer them to our we're kind of we're very much a destination nursery within British Columbia, and then we of course ship across Canada. And unfortunately, we don't ship to the U.S. That border's just a little bit too much of a pain to deal with. But yeah,
Yeah, that's too bad. And we had met this summer at the Perennial Plant Association, and that was taking place in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And one of the difficulties is when you're coming from across the border, you can't bring sample plants, you can't bring things home from that type of meeting.
yeah. I mean, there are ways to do it, but
Hmm.
you need to get the right paperwork organized, and that takes some time and some doing. And sometimes it's just not worth it.
Especially for perennial plants, whereas woody plants, you could bare root and do those a little bit easier, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, you could do perennials too. And, I've done it before, but you need to get
Hmm.
your phytosanitary certificate, which
Oh,
means
yeah.
hooking up with the USDA officer, and all that stuff. So, I mean, I have that done all the time for my imports from all around the world. But if I'm just at if I'm visiting the States and I'm at a conference and there's some plants at a nursery or at the conference or somewhere that I see, then I start, my heart starts palpitating and I start getting excited because I'm experiencing a little bit of plant lust. I just have to kind of work through that, and just, look for the plant elsewhere, and come to terms with the fact that I can't take it home with me on that trip at least.
Yes, and then it's always on your want list after that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But that's part of the fun in gardening, right? Is learning about new plants and then going on the hunt to try to find them.
Hmm. And so for your new ground cover book, and I should read the entire title because, like all books these days, right, it's not just two words, it's much longer. So it is The Complete Book of Ground Covers, and then the subtitle 4,000 Plants That Reduce Maintenance, Control Erosion, and Beautify the Landscape. So let's talk a little bit about how this book came about, and when did you first get the idea to write it? Or were you approached by the publisher, or did you approach them?
Um, Actually, it was at in 2010 in Portland at the Perennial Plant Association conference. There, I met Tom Fisher, who is the one of the editors, or who was, he's retired now, but one of the editors of Timber Press, based in Portland. And yeah, we just became friends, casual friends. We would chat every once in a while. And at a certain point, I said to him just casually, "Oh, yeah, I'd love to write a book one day." And he said, "Oh, great, send me some ideas." So I sent him some ideas, and he liked them, but he thought they'd be a little bit too esoteric. And so we just started discussing things, and he said, now that I've gotten to know you a little bit better and I kind of understand, the breadth of what you do at your nursery and kind of the broad knowledge that I had in terms of perennials and other garden plants. He said, we have been looking for somebody to work on this particular project for many years, and we haven't been able to find anybody who's kind of got the expertise and probably, who's crazy enough to take on the project. And so they had published a book in the mid 90s on ground covers, which was a great reference. But over time, these things get a little bit out of date. They, the plant selections are not in cultivation any longer, and lots of new things have popped up. So they really wanted somebody to write a new encyclopedia of ground covers for them. And so he presented this to me, and I said, "Ground covers? That's not very exciting. That's kind of boring." And that was my first kind of a reaction to it. And I kind of mentioned it to my partner and to some of my friends, and they started making fun of me because they're like, "Ground covers? That's like, Gary, you're all about like crazy plants and weird plants and rare perennials and zonal denial and subtropicals and, always pushing the envelope. And ground covers are always thought of as that kind of utilitarian plant that, you just, you plant them and then you walk all over them, right? They're there to serve a purpose, but they're not there to be exciting." And so it took me a little bit of time to work through this, but I really wanted the opportunity to write a book. And I was excited about the idea of an encyclopedia because here I am with a nursery with 5,000 plants in it. So obviously I love diversity. So I'm very much attracted to, trying to discover and learn about everything I can. And I want to include every plant in my nursery. I would include every garden plant in my nursery if I could, but that wouldn't be very economic. But I really started, as I started researching ground covers, I realized what an amazing group of plants they are. Not only are they incredibly diverse, but they also offer up so many different possibilities in the garden. From an aesthetic point of view, you can do all kinds of amazing designing and with them, and all kinds of playful things with them. But also, when we think about the functionality of our gardens and how we can reduce maintenance in our gardens, how we can save money and time in our gardens, ground cover can be helpful with that. And then we've become so aware of sustainability in our gardens, and that our gardens exist in a wider world, and that wider world has all kinds of challenges in terms of our carbon footprint and climate change, and also supporting populations of our pollinators and our bird species and the other critters that we share this place with. So I started realizing, holy cow, ground covers are not the most boring group of plants. Ground covers are the most interesting group of plants, and they are one of the integral groups of plants for really kind of meeting the moment that we're in as gardeners and as a society. So that's how the project came about, and it took 9 years to research it, to write it, to photograph for it, and finally, after that amount of time, here it is. It just came out. Just came out in October 2022. So it's an exciting time.
Hmm. Yeah, and this is the part where I have to jump in and talk about my book, Gary.
I've seen the proofs of your book, and it
Hmm.
looks fantastic. I'm really excited about it because I think your book and my book are both arriving at great times. And I love how your book is really focusing on that kind of lawn alternative thing, which is the most important, the most important aspect of ground covers when it comes to making our gardens more sustainable. So yeah, I
Hmm.
think your garden is, sorry, your book is incredibly timely, and I think our books are great companions for each other. So I think everybody should have both of them.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
And I was going to say the long title of mine, Ground Cover Revolution, and then the subtitle, How to Use Sustainable Low Maintenance Low Water Ground Covers to Replace Your Turf, is more pointed title in that it's telling you to replace your turf, although it's not an anti-lawn book per se. But you could certainly interpret it that way. And then yours is definitely more the encyclopedic type of collection, because I'm featuring 40 profiles of top ground covers, and you have 4,000. So quite the difference in that way.
Yeah, I know, but yeah, yours is, yours narrows it down to, a kind of a bite-sized topic. But I was really struck when thinking about lawns and how ground covers can play such an important role too. And you're right. I mean, lawns play a part in our gardens. We need them in certain places for
Hmm.
recreation and also for aesthetics, because lawns are that negative space that helps to show off the positive space of the gardens and the plantings. Um, but when you think about lawns, it is that's the biggest opportunity for increasing sustainability in our gardens. And I found some statistics that said in the continental U.S., a full 2% of the land mass is covered in turf grass. That's
Hmm.
40 million acres of the continental U.S. And so that's a lot of green desert sitting out there that we have to mow, and we have to you know water and care for, and that's a lot of landmass that's not supporting our native
Hmm.
pollinators and our native little animals, and also lost opportunities for doing beautiful things in the garden. So yeah, I think I'm excited about your book. So tell me more about it.
Yeah, so it came about in a little bit different way than yours in that it was a long time coming on the back burner, which is similar in that I'd been growing various ground covers in my little urban garden for years and trying to do battle with each other. Like I tore out all the turf grass lawn and then said, well, now what? I can't just let the whole thing erode while I'm waiting to put in flower beds everywhere. And in my naivety, thinking it was all going to be perennial gardens at some point, but realizing in the meantime, it's got to be some type of ground cover or something to hold it in. So basically, if I found a plant that was a fast spreading, grabbing a hold of the turf and beating it out and overrunning turf or overrunning the English ivy that was coming in from the neighbors, then I was growing it. So I was just doing lots and lots of years of experimenting and taking my own photos and notes and not even thinking of a book at all, just thinking, this is how I'm going to conquer this little problem I have. And then that's after publishing the Urban Garden last year with Terry Spate, I started to think about another project. And then I thought, you know what? I have all this research and practical information about ground covers, and I give a regular talk to garden clubs and at public gardens on ground cover alternatives to lawn that was extremely popular. And so I thought I should just turn that talk into this book. And that's how that came about.
Yeah, it's very organically, right? You've been doing the research in
Hmm.
your own little garden project for so long, and yeah, there it is.
And also, I think I was seeing kind of what we're both seeing, which with the convergence of our books is, the eco interest, the um, trying to replace what you're doing in your life, not just because you don't want to be mowing every week or watering all the time, but you want to add to the Earth's bounty. Like I want to have something productive and beautiful right in my garden, or my landscape that I can control and I can somehow contribute to the Earth's bounty, like either by supporting wildlife or just not using chemicals in my lawn.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And ground covers are what's going to do that.
Yep. And the one thing I was looking at today, Gary, on our two books is the other big difference besides the number of listings of ground covers is that I say ground cover as one word and you have it as two words. So maybe we should debate that a little bit and see what we think.
Originally I had it as one word because I thought, I googled ground cover, and I looked at
Mm-hmm.
like 50 different sites, and I looked at my bookshelf, and I looked for any book that might mention ground covers to see how they wrote it. And then I finally asked my editor, and I said, what can how do we spell this? And he said, well, you can really choose. And I'm like, because he says it's kind of written both ways. And so I went with one word at first. And then when I kind of saw it written out, I thought the title looked better if it was going to be two words. So then I opted for the two-word option.
See, I thought you were going to say it was a Canadian thing.
Well, I don't know. Maybe. I mean, we
Yeah.
follow the British spelling of things, which was
Mm-hmm.
actually hard writing the book because I'd always spell it the Canadian or British way, and then I realized, wait, this is a book that's going to be published by a U.S. Publisher. I'm going to have to, I'm going to have to spell things the American way. But I
Mm-hmm.
know I don't think it's, and I think I thought about that when I was. When I was trying to decide how to spell it, because I think I looked at British sites as well as Canadian sites specifically as well, and they spelled it both ways in,
Mm-hmm.
in outside of the US as well. So I think it's just a choice. It can be spelled either way.
I agree. It's
Yeah.
definitely a choice, and both are correct, and both are perfectly usable. But I had it as two words, and sometimes when I gave the talk, so and I had two gone back and forth, and then I decided, you know what, I like it better as one word. And when you have the title "Ground Cover Revolution," it does look better as "Ground Cover Revolution" as one word. So there
Oh,
you go.
that's yeah, yeah. Well, it was a dilemma. It took a long time to decide, and then I was halfway written the book before I decided to change it to the other spelling.
Yeah, and I'm surprised also that your publisher was, let you make that decision, which was very nice of them.
Yeah, I guess so. I think I
Mhm.
mean I think they kind of researched it themselves and realized, well, it kind of has two
Mhm.
spellings, so whichever you want.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so um that does bring up when we talk about international words or spelling. My book is aimed internationally, and that kind of constrained some of those 40 profiles I did. So I had to pick plants that were available in most countries or at least familiar to most people. And it also constrained a little bit some of the profile descriptions that are in there, and that I couldn't do USDA zones per se.
Mm.
But we use temperature ranges instead. Did you have the same profile questions in your book?
Well, I mean, I mean, my book is meant to cover the temperate gardening world. So I did a lot of, the whole first year was just about researching basically all of the ground covers that I could see from websites, from the availability lists and catalogs of wholesale and retail nurseries throughout North America, um, as well as I also researched Europe, the UK, continental Europe, as well as other places like New Zealand and Australia to really get a good sense of everything that was growing out there. So my book is basically aimed from zone 1 to zone 8. However, it is the majority of copies are going to be sold in the US and in Canada, and I mean, I think they think about 10% are going to be sold in the UK and the rest of Europe. So the audience is mainly North American, and we understand those the USDA hardiness zones. We use the exact same zones as you. So I've gone with the zones as opposed to the temperatures. But um, yeah, it's I don't know. Either way, right? Uh,
Hmm. Hmm.
and so when we see minus 25 or something on yours, then that's we can gauge that as gardeners because we know what our climate does, and if we're confused, we can just look up how minus 25 corresponds with the hardiness zones.
Exactly. Yeah, it definitely made me become a lot more intimate with my growing zones as far as their temperature ranges when I had to research each one and check those out. Yeah. Uh,
Yeah, you probably have them all memorized now. It's probably like memorizing your multiplication tables or something.
exactly. I'm like, I have this little chart of the temperatures for each zone. And the other thing I was going to say about the aiming at an international audience also constrains the use of native. So when I tend to say about this plant, one ground cover that this is native to our region, and these are some non-natives that are also available, blah blah blah. So then I'm more talking about where this plant is native to or originates in. But I'm not necessarily saying where you're going to find your native
Yeah,
plant.
exactly. And I did the same thing because so my background is in plant ecology. So I did a couple degrees in the sciencey side of plants as opposed to horticulture, and so I love that idea of where plants come from, what kind of habitats they grow in, and because it kind of tells the story of place and kind of that and the story of the evolution of these plants. Plus, knowing what kind of habitat they come from really helps inform what kind of garden conditions we put them in when we want to grow them. So yeah, so I did have to think about there being an international audience and then reading from all kinds of different places in the world for sure.
Hmm. So, one of the attributes of ground covers is that they can fill in fairly quickly, which also makes them, we'll just use the polite term, aggressive. And
Right. Yeah.
so, a lot of it can be a plant that some people would label as invasive in their area, but then are perfectly well behaving in other areas. So, like all things, gardening is local. How it affects your local growing area or climate is what you really want to know. So, did you label in your book whether something is invasive in some areas or has invasive tendencies, or how did you deal with that conundrum?
Yeah, certainly that is an issue, and also it depends on the size of garden you have. Like if you have a small garden, then you might just have an aggressively growing ground cover that is just going to grow too fast for your space. Whereas that exact same ground cover in another part of the city where they've got really big lots is going to be the perfect ground cover for that space. So I mean, there's such a range of different ground covers, and some are very slow to spread, even though they will eventually form, a nice mat, and others are really quite rambunctious. I did so. There's kind of those two issues. There are those two different words that we play with a lot, and sometimes we use them interchangeably in gardening. But there's aggressive or overly aggressive, and then there's invasive. And so I would say that the definitions I went with would be if it's aggressive, then it's a plant that is just not well chosen for its space. It's too aggressive for the size of space you're working with. Whereas an invasive plant is something that can escape a garden and become invasive within our natural environment beyond the garden. So in our forests, in our fields, along our water courses, in our native habitats. And so definitely that's always a concern when you're promoting plants is you don't want to be promoting plants that are invasive and affect um, that could affect uh, the natural habitats of those regions. So I did, in any case, when I was researching these plants, I was looking for information as well to try to figure out whether they were invasive. And sometimes plants are invasive in a certain region, but not in other regions. English ivy is kind of
Hmm.
invasive almost everywhere it grows, but other plants like donkey tail spurge seems to be invasive in drier habitats such as kind of zone 5, zone 6 areas of interior British Columbia, for instance, but not really in coastal British Columbia, just because our climate is different. So I did try to discuss that in the book, and talk about the vigor of ground covers, and what kind of situations and sizes of gardens they would be best applied to, and then also to include information about if those plants are potentially invasive in our natural habitats within certain regions.
Hmm. Yeah, in mine, I have a rating for slow, moderate, or fast spreading, and a
Mm,
little
yeah,
rating in there and on a chart where there's reference charts where you can go down and look up if you say want something to be fast spreading, but then is also, of course, a could be a con if it's fast spreading and takes over everything else in your garden.
right.
So there's ratings like that, and we did talk about ratings for wildlife use. So whether it is for a pollinator or provides food for somebody, which again could also be a red flag that if it's of use to wildlife, that could also mean it will be eaten by that wildlife. So there's always that as well.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I like your charts. Actually, they're very handy. Um, I tended to put that information within the text of the plants, and the culture and care aspects, as well as the uses aspects, talking about how fast things will grow, and also if they have particular benefits for pollinators and other wildlife.
Hmm. And one of the chart ratings had to actually go back in and add after I'd done several profiles was the height of the ground cover, because I started to realize there's an assumption out there when you use the word ground cover, or two words ground cover, that
Mhm.
that it literally just hugs the ground or is just a couple inches high. But there are ground covers that are taller. Some are moderate size, maybe knee high, and some are even taller than that. So, do you have a height limit on your ground covers that you included in the book, or do you have some that are even shrubby or taller?
Yeah, and that was one of the things I wrestled with while writing the book, is what should be my cutoff. Uh, and again, it really comes down to your scale, for instance. So if you have a tiny postage stamp garden, then you're really going to want ground covers that stay pretty low. But if you've got a big space, or even think about like a giant park, for instance, you could plant a shrub that might grow 3 feet high but grow 10 feet wide. So, within a landscape situation or an institutional planting, that is essentially a ground cover, because it is growing, 3 times wider than its height, and it is spreading across the ground. So, so we do have that narrow definition of ground covers, which tends to be that they're rhizomatous or stoloniferous, or trailing plants that stay, quite low within a few inches of the ground. But, you know, in this book, and I can see in your book as well, I mean, it's about performing all of these things that we want ground covers to do. So, making the space beautiful and interesting, but also preventing erosion, keeping down weeds. And so there are lots of different creative ways that you can cover ground with different plants. So of course, all my book includes all of those plants within that narrower definition of ground covers. But like you in your book, I see you've also included plants that tend to be a little bit more clumping, that we wouldn't think of as a ground cover. But if
Hmm.
we mass plant those, so take hostas for instance, you could. I've seen hostas mass planted, 100 or 200 or 500 hostas in the understory of a shady kind of woodland area, and those hostas planted at the right distance so that their leaves all touch and that they form a closed cover. Those hostas are acting as a ground cover, even though we might take that same hosta and just plant one in the garden and we think of it as an accent plant. But taken together, hosta or the coral bells, heuchera, or different grasses, if we mass plant them together at the right distances, we can form a closed cover, and they can act as a ground cover. So I went broader there, because you can cover ground with those as well. You wouldn't think of you wouldn't think of a clematis or a Virginia creeper or a campsis or other vines as ground covers, but a vine that doesn't have anything to grow up, any vertical support, will clamber across the ground and form a ground cover. So especially for a little bit larger areas. And for slopes, you can use vines as really interesting and effective and kind of billowing ground covers. So I tended to take a broader a broader definition of ground covers, and then I tried to kind of keep myself to about 12 to 18 inches of height. But there were cases where I went to maybe 2 or 3 feet. Uh, Out here on the West Coast, we grow California lilac a lot, ceanothus, and there are dwarf cultivars that might only get to 6 inches or 12 inches, but there's some that get to 2 feet or 3 feet high, but they'll get to 6 or 8 or 10 feet wide. So, and you could think about it in terms of junipers as well, like the wide spreading junipers. There's some that are really quite low, but there are some that might get to a foot or 2 or 3, but get appreciably wide and be able to form a kind of tall or mounding ground cover. So I did break through that 12 to 18 inch height from time to time to include plants that really did have an amazing spread relative to their height. Was that something that you also had to wrestle with in choosing plants for your book?
Hmm. Exactly. And yeah, the clumping versus truly spreading like a ground cover, either by the roots or over ground still. And then same with the vines. You were like, oh, I could go whole hog on the vines, so to speak, or just pick one or two. And then those are the ones that usually tended to fall into the almost invasive category, where a lot of the vines. So that made the decision kind of easy for me since I'm winnowing it down to a top 40, so to speak, whereas you're doing a comprehensive collection of all that are available. So yeah, those were definitely all concerns. And I just remember this one attendee at one of my past ground cover talks saying, "Hey, that's not a ground cover because it was above 3 inches tall."
Right.
So having that person's voice in my ear, I still chose some of the taller ground covers because, like you said, they can still be fully functioning as ground covers, and in certain settings, very beautiful and fill in. And especially as we're talking about slopes and covering it, the fact that they are coming a little bit higher doesn't matter. You're not going to be stepping into there if you're trying to cover a steep slope or a ravine with something that will block out weeds or other invasive plants. Then the height is not so much of a concern.
Yeah, exactly. And there were some cases where I wasn't going to include Phlomis Russelliana, Jerusalem sage, and because of course it grows to blooms at 3 feet tall. But then I came across a photo, and it was from winter time, so it was the stems had died, but they were still they were brown and still ornamental. But there it is. It's semi-evergreen to evergreen with just its basal leaves forming an amazing ground cover, only 4 to 6 inches tall off the ground, and in a way as well, even when it does bloom, it's a little bit of a see-through plant. So, you know,
Hmm.
you can use it, and it does spread slowly over time. So you can use it as a ground cover. You're not going to use it to plant between pavers, and you're not going to use it in certain situations where you choose more of a classic ground cover. But in certain situations, it can act. These different plants can act as ground covers.
Hmm. And that definitely applies to a lot of the perennials that I had picked, like Rudbeckia, where there's a basal foliage, growing flat against the ground, and then you have the taller wands of flowers coming above. And you could whack it back to always have that basal foliage. I mean,
Yeah,
that's a choice, not a choice I would make. But
especially if
yes,
you don't like yellow flowers.
yes. But so it's whether that has that ground hugging quality underneath it. It was really the determination in that.
How did you narrow it down to 40 ground covers? That would have been
Whew,
excruciating.
Gary. It was tough. And yeah, looking at your 4,000, I'm like, I wish I could have done this. I wish I could have done that. So yeah, in my talks, there's always the bonus. And I'm like, and here's a few I wasn't able to include. But, there's only so much paper and page space. And I wanted to also devote the first third of the book is the why and how,
Right.
and also some inspirational ideas. So we wanted to give some space for photos of landscapes that showed ground covers to really good effect and how these homeowners have done it. And I always try to include realistic photos, not fantasy
Yeah.
photos. so
Now,
so
a
that
little
was one of
fantasy
my
from time to time is nice.
yes. But definitely wanted to say this is possible. It's not just photoshopped mosaic
Yeah.
of, I've seen some catalogs and I won't name them, but I've seen some mail order catalogs where I'm like, that is not a real planting, where they piece together the same plant,
Right. Yeah.
side by side by
Cool.
side by side. So yeah, definitely wanted to be honest and forthright in that. And that does bring me to the photos, which when you have 4,000 selection, that's a lot of photos, Gary. And I think you took almost all of the photos in your book.
Yeah, there's about 650 photos, and I took almost all of them. I think there's 30 or 40 that, as it turns out, at the end of things, I didn't have a photo of a certain plant. I don't know how, because I spent 9 years taking pictures of every single ground cover I could see. Actually, it was really annoying because sometimes I didn't have a photo of one of the most common ground covers out there, but maybe I just assumed I already had a photo of that. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know. Yeah, so there were certain things, and I mean, my publisher and I both thought we'd finish the book within a couple of years. We never thought it would take 9 years. It took 9 years to research and write it mainly, and then in the spaces where the summertime and the traveling time and the conference times, that's when I was taking a lot of the photos, which was not really times when I had times of the year when I had time to sit down and write. Turns out I needed 9 years to get all of the photos I needed for the book. So almost almost every single genus in the book has at least one photo that represents and gives you a sense of what that group of plants looks like. And then, like you, I also have some lots of introductory chapters that talk about the how and the why and the various benefits of ground covers. And then also, I really enjoyed talking about designing with ground covers as well. So there's introductory chapters with, and maybe there are a few little fantasy photos in there. Well, not total fantasy. They're actually real places,
Mm-hmm.
but just places where they've really done beautiful jobs with ground covers. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so the introductory chapters have a lot of pretty photos as well as the A to Z section.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed looking at some of the examples of ground cover design in yours. And yeah, I would say in mine, about 50% of the photos I personally took. And same, where you thought you had a photo for sure of moss.
Yeah.
And then you're like, where that is that moss photo? Or you just can't put your finger on it. So you have to outsource that photo. And also, I was reaching out to other garden communicators to see what was available out there and to say, do you have great examples? Because I wanted to make sure, of course, that it wasn't just from the Mid Atlantic, that it was from an international perspective.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I thought at one point, I'd um, send out an email in my email newsletter to all of my nursery customers, say, hey, I'm taking pictures of ground covers. If you have amazing displays of certain ground covers, send me an email and I'll come and I'll photograph them. But didn't actually have time to do that. But could have gotten even more beautiful photos. But I don't know. In all, I took about 250,000 to 300,000 photos over 9 years. So I think that was probably enough.
Hmm. Yeah, and those outtakes can always go into your talks.
Exactly, and they do. I
Yeah.
also have a companion talk on my book,
Hmm.
and so there's lots of pictures from the book, but then there's a whole bunch of extras, which because you have those favorite photos that you just had to cut, and you couldn't include, and
Hmm.
but you feel sad about that because it's such a beautiful photo. So I put them in the talk, so people get to see
Yay.
those and get a little bonus when I go to to
Hmm.
speak to them. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think in mine, the profiles, each of them has a close-up and then an in situ picture of what it would look like as a ground cover. But in my talks, I get to show different close-ups. You're like this
Yeah,
time
of
of
course.
year or with a pollinator on it. So that's always fun to share too. And I should note here too, Gary, that we're both going to be speaking at the Northwest Flower Garden Festival in Seattle in February, but on different days. So if you're at that next February 2023, you can catch Gary on one day and then me on another day.
Yeah, I'll actually be there on 2 days. I think Wednesday and Thursday. And then
hmm
what day are you there?
I think I'm Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, but giving different talks on different
Ah,
days.
okay. Well, we'll overlap, I think.
hmm
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing your talk there, and I can't wait to.
and we'll have to go for a drink and compare notes.
Yes, will be like the ground cover cocktail hour
Exactly.
for us. So that does bring us to your favorite ground covers. So I had to narrow it down to 40, Gary. So I'm going to make you narrow down 4,000 plants into, let's see, a top 3 to 5. Do you think you could do that?
Well, I narrowed it. It was tough, but I did narrow it down into a couple favorites for shade, a couple favorites for
Mm-hmm.
sun, and then a
Great.
couple favorites for slopes and erosion control, and a couple favorites for lawn alternatives.
Okay.
Yeah,
Perfect. All right, let's start with those sun
the
ones.
sun ones. Okay, so well, you can't go wrong in the sun with stone crops, and everybody knows, that's a classic ground cover, the sedums. But it's been amazing with the growth in the green roof and living wall industry is that so many additional stone crops have entered cultivation over this last decade or two. There's all kinds
Mm-hmm.
of really interesting stone crops out there. There's the normal stuff, of course. We need Sedum angelina, and the Sedum spuriums are really great. But I have two favorites from sedums, and that's Sedum tetractinum. That's the Chinese stone crop. That one is really cool because it has very kind of rounded leaves, and then in the winter as well as in the summer, if it gets stressed, then it develops coppery orange tones to it, which is really beautiful. And then I really love Sedum Forsterianum, which is a little bit like Sedum blue spruce or Sedum angelina, and then it's very fine textured, except the leaves are much finer and give an even finer texture than those ones. So I love those. And then I do have another favorite sun one. It's Cushion Bolax. That's Azarella trifurcata nana. It's a really cool plant in the carrot family. It is hardy to zone
Hmm.
7, and it forms this low evergreen ground cover. And if you touch the plants, they actually feel like plastic. It feels like, how you get those cheap green mats that you would have, at the entrance to a door to clean your shoes
Mm-hmm.
off. You touch those, it kind of feels the same. It feels like this kind of hard plastic, but it forms this neat billowing ground cover, and it can trail over walls and kind of look like slow motion green lava as it kind of oozes over walls. So that one's definitely a favorite. So those are narrowed down for sun. Those are two a couple ground covers that
Mm-hmm.
really resonate with me.
I love that green lava. I think that could be another alternative name to your book.
Green lava. Yeah, exactly.
And then your shade or part shade.
So people make fun of me for this one, but in terms of a commonly available group of shade plants, I do love the bugleweeds. I do love the ajuga. I know they
Mm-hmm.
can seed into lawns sometimes and form bugle lawn, but whenever I see the foliage of black scallop or burgundy glow, or there's been new cultivars that have come out in the last little while with other burgundy tones or golden colors, as well as the cute little ones like chocolate chip. They're easy, they're versatile, they can go from shade up to, they can almost do pretty full sun for us on the West Coast, maybe not quite
Mm-hmm.
so much sun for you in the East, but they're versatile. You can grow them in pots. Um, you can stick them in nooks and crannies. They'll trail over the edge of walls, and they've got those pretty flowers that the bees like in the spring. So a
Yeah,
juniper.
And Gary, I'm gonna fight with you on that because I love Ajuga. And and I was gonna say that those pretty flowers are perfectly timed here for us here in the DC area in that they bloom right around Mother's Day and these tall purple little spikes. And when we pot that up for our garden club sale, and we're like, $2 a pop for that Ajuga. Who would want that, right? And we stick it in the ground cover section of our garden club sale. They fly off the tables.
Is it because they're in bloom?
It's because 'cause they're in bloom
There
at
you go.
that right second, and they just look purple and pretty, so, people don't even care.
Well, they're really easy to propagate, and you should probably be
Mhm.
charging $3 per pot.
I know, we should charge more, but yes,
Yeah,
definitely an attribute for them is that they bloom right at Mother's Day time for
yeah.
us.
So there's another shade plant I love, if I can, is Adiantum venustum. So that's it's the evergreen Himalayan maidenhair fern. It's a slow growing ground cover. Uh, a lot of us know the more common Adiantum pedatum, the main maidenhair fern with its 5 fingers or 5 or so fingers. This is a little ground cover one that grows to, I don't know, usually about 4 to 6 inches tall. It's got a beautiful texture to it in kind of light greens, and it's evergreen in mild winter climates, so probably evergreen in the or semi-evergreen in your region of the world, evergreen for us. But you can also shear it down in late winter, and then the new fronds come up, and the new fronds are a beautiful coppery orangey color, which are really quite beautiful. So that's another favorite of mine for a smaller garden kind of situation for shade.
And ferns are so incredible as ground covers, and I do need to point out, Gary, Adiantum is a Latin name, correct, of the maidenhair fern,
Yeah.
and
Uh-huh.
adamantium is a fictional metal that you will see featured in the Marvel Comics universe. So don't get those 2 mixed up.
Ah, there you go. Yeah, Adiantum. Yeah, a great group of plants. Yeah.
And so you were saying your slope or covering ground cover.
And I came to love this plant by seeing it a lot in your neck of the woods. It's Liriope spicata, or
hmm
lily turf. I actually
hmm
saw it used a lot in kind of some of the gardens, like Chanticleer, for instance, maybe Longwood, and different private gardens around DC and Baltimore. I think it's a great plant for it's a great lawn alternative because it looks kind of grassy, even although a little bit taller. So it has those nice long leathery grass-like leaves. It has cute little flowers. It spreads with time. It's evergreen, uh, and it's really good at maintaining slopes as well as for a lawn alternative. And then the other one, it's boring, but man, it's so useful. Pachysandra. So Pachysandra terminalis. It can be a little bit slow to establish sometimes, but it is actually quite beautiful, even though it's more of a normal kind of plant. It's a real doer for slopes and for controlling erosion on slopes.
hmm And I assume you included the procumbens, the
Oh, I love
American native one.
procumbens.
hmm
I do love procumbens as well, and that's a great one that I see a lot in your neck of the woods. We don't grow it so much out our way, but I do offer it at Phoenix from time to time. It's a
hmm
beautiful plant.
hmm And for those listeners, that's our native Pachysandra, but it is a slow, and I'm talking turtle's pace, terrapin's pace, slow to fill in ground cover. But, if you put in several plugs and you wait a few years, it will be a reward.
Yeah, and the foliage is so beautiful on that. The
hmm
modeling to the foliage
Oh,
is, and the
yes.
texture of the foliage and those kind of rippled edges to the leaves. It's well worth it.
hmm And then you had a last category of your favorites.
So for lawn alternatives, I have two favorites. One for
hmm
more sun, one for a little bit more shade or sun. So woolly thyme is one of my favorites. Thymus pseudolunuginosus. Does that one grow well for you on the eastern seaboard?
hmm Just has to be full sun and well draining soil. So you wouldn't put it in not even 2 hours of shade a day. It's got to be way out there.
Full all
Um,
the time.
yeah, and that would be under roses or other treatments like that. I've seen it do really well. And of course, on the edges, like the edge of a sidewalk or where pathways meet, that it does really well there.
Yeah, that's cool. For us out here, it's probably our best creeping time. It for some reason it also, I mean, it needs good drainage, but it really does well with our wet winters. It's really quite tolerant of it, whereas other creeping times, if they're in rich soils, seem to fizzle over time. I don't know. The I think the woolly thyme here is just so vigorous that it really puts up with our climate out here. So I love it. It's great. It's great for trailing over things too. We once used it not in a ground cover situation, but in a hanging basket, and we had it trailing 2 feet by the end of the season. So it's a really vigorous grower. And then the other one is kind of a weird esoteric thing, and it's actually a kind of lady's mantle. So we think of, lady's mantle are those beautiful clumping plants with those kind of scalloped leaves where the water droplets sit on the leaves like little jewels kind of shimmering there because the leaves are hydrophobic. But there's actually a trailing one called Alchemilla ellenbeckii, uh,
Mm.
and it has it trails across the ground, and you wouldn't recognize it as an alchemilla unless you looked really closely at the leaves, and then you'd see that it's got tiny leaves, and all the leaves are probably like the size of the nail on your pinky finger. But they're the exact same shape as the larger lady's mantles, just in miniature and on long trailing stems. The stems are also usually reddish, so you've got these nice little green leaves with the reddish stems, and then you do get those little tiny chartreuse electric green flowers here and there. I guess that's the probably late spring or summer you get those. So that's a cool one for a little bit shadier or part shade situation for as a lawn alternative.
Mm. Yeah, I don't know that one, and I have a bit of trouble with ladies mantle in general, just because I have a lot of dry shade, and it definitely needs moist conditions. But that one is very tempting sounding, Gary.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can do well in average situations. I don't know if it would really love dry shade, but
Hmm.
it's so cute that you would just want to go out with your watering can and give it a little extra water in dry periods because it's an
Yeah,
adorable little thing.
maybe near a downspout or something, I could work that
Something
in.
like that. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So, where could listeners contact you to find out more about the book and about your perennial operation?
So our website is phoenixperennials.com. And so it's Phoenix, like Phoenix, Arizona. We do get phone calls from people in Phoenix, Arizona, sometimes looking for perennials, and then we have to tell them that we're in Canada, but much to their chagrin. But yeah, phoenixperennials.com. There's information on my nursery there, and unfortunately, we don't ship to the States, as I said. But if you've got Canadian listeners, they can definitely visit that. But there's also information on the book there as well. But of course, the book is available everywhere. It's available. You can get it at your local bookstore. You can buy it from all the big online retailers, and it's available across North America now, and then it'll be available in Europe and other international destinations. I think starting December 1st, it'll be available in all of around the world. So you can get it anywhere you like to buy your books.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Gary, for sharing your encyclopedic knowledge of ground covers and for sharing about your new book. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in Seattle soon.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing you and also seeing your book. And maybe we should go on tour together or something.
I think so. It's kind of like a Abbott and Costello, ground covers versus ground covers.
Exactly.
Thank you again, Gary.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.
Amaryllis plant profile. Amaryllis, Hippeastrum species, is a large flowering bulb that is commonly grown indoors for holiday decoration. It is native to Central and South America and includes 90 species and over 600 cultivars. The flower colors can range from the classic red to white, salmon, pink, or creamy yellow. Some flowers are very large, others are more delicate and narrow types. They also come in single and double flower varieties. As many as 6 flowers will bloom on a single stem. In general, the larger the flower bulb, the more flowers it will produce. To prompt the amaryllis to start to grow, place the bulb in a container filled with lukewarm water for an hour. You can then plant the amaryllis bulb in a container filled with sterile potting mix. Be sure to leave at least the top third of the bulb above the soil level and to choose a container with good drainage that is only an inch or 2 wider than the bulb itself. Amaryllis like to fit snugly in their pots. Because the flowers can be top-heavy, pick a pot that has some weight and heft to it. Amaryllis prefer a room temperature between 68 and 74 degrees. They also need sufficient light to bloom. If it doesn't get enough, its stems will stretch out and need support. Rotate the pot a quarter turn each time you water the plant. After the flowers finish blooming, the bulbs need a period of recovery and rejuvenation. Cut off the flower stalks, but leave the foliage intact and reduce watering. They can be grown as a houseplant and then placed out in the summer to gather more energy for blooming again in the winter. Repot them every 3 to 4 years. If you live in USDA zones 8 through 11, they can be planted outdoors in the spring and stay there year-round. Bring them in before the weather gets cold and discontinue watering. Place them in a cool, dark place to remain dormant for at least 2 months. Then take them out of storage, water them thoroughly, put them in a sunny spot again, and start the bloom cycle over. The National Garden Bureau has declared 2023 as the year of the amaryllis. Amaryllis, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, the only thing I can see in bloom in my home garden are the cool season annuals like alyssum, viola, and snapdragons. Over at the community garden plot, we've cleared out another bed and covered that with straw. In the local gardening world, the new issue of Washington Gardener magazine, November 2022, has been posted, and I encourage you to go to our website and check that out. The cover story is on a living wall in Wheaton, Maryland, and there are also features on Carolina chickadees, how to make your holiday tree last longer, meet the Cook sisters, common crickets, a new Jacob's ladder, and optimizing urban environments. For upcoming events happening locally, a few are virtual, so anybody, anywhere could sign up for them. One is on Tuesday, November 29th at 7 p.m., and that is Biological Control of Invasive Weeds. This is hosted by the Maryland Native Plant Society and is an overview of plant pathology research. It's being held via Zoom, and you can register for that for free at mdflora.org. Another online event you can sign up for free is Thursday, December 1st at 12 noon. Outdoor containers with fresh greens. Join Peg Beer Merrifield Garden Center's plant and design specialist for that Zoom seminar. And an in-person event coming up that you might be interested in is on Tuesday, December 6th, starting at 9:30 a.m., the first annual Maryland Mushroom Grower Symposium. Now, this is for a professional development, and it's for specialty mushroom growers in the area. It is taking place in Annapolis, Maryland. The fee has been subsidized, so it is just a nominal $12, and you can find out more about that at extension.umd.edu and look under the new events tab. Happy gardening!
In the new book, The Urban Garden by Kathy Jensen Terry Spate, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space while also making a lush outdoor living area you'll crave spending time in. Whether you're growing edible plants or beautiful flowers, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the Urban Garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
This is the last word on 5 year-round daily gardening habits by Carol Michael. I'm co-host of the podcast, The Garden Angelist with Dee Nash. This essay comes from my book, Homegrown and Handpicked, A Year in a Gardening Life. 5 year-round daily gardening habits. When the last summer-like days of October are past and the frost is on the pumpkin in November, it's time to get serious about preparing for winter and spring. As is my habit, I clear off the vegetable garden and leave it ready so I can plant peas and lettuce in mid-March without having to till up the ground. I make sure I have a stash of potting soil in the garage so when I buy the first pansies and violas in early spring, I'll have everything I need to plant a few containers to decorate the front porch before Easter. Indoors, fall is the beginning of the gardening book and catalog season. All those gardening books and seed catalogs promise to entertain and enlighten me and give me hope through the winter. If they don't, well then, all hope is lost. As I continue to work in my late fall garden, long after most of my neighbors have called it quits for the season, put up their Christmas lights and started their wintertime hibernation, I'm left alone to ponder what gardening is all about. I imagine ways to keep the gardening spirit alive when the air is frosty and there's snow on the ground. It was during one of those quiet days when I came up with 5 daily gardening habits to keep in mind even when I cannot be in the garden. Smell a flower. Try to keep some fresh flowers around you wherever you are. Sometimes the fresh flower is on a houseplant, and sometimes it's a stem or two of cut flowers picked up at the grocery store. Sometimes the flower doesn't even have a scent, but leaning in close to see if it does should put a smile on anyone's face. Touch a leaf. You can do this if you have a favorite houseplant nearby at all times. Be sure to keep the plant watered and give it some good light. If you want, you can also talk to it. Some say it helps the plant when you talk to it, others say it is foolishness. But there's nothing wrong with being foolish at times, and maybe it does help the plant. Sow a few seeds. If you don't have any plant seeds to sow, and often we don't in the wintertime, sow seeds of kindness and helpfulness. Those kinds of seeds are free and can go a long way to add enjoyment to someone's day. Breathe some fresh air. If you can do that while gardening or exercising in a garden, so much the better. Get your hands dirty every day, perhaps by gardening a little outside. If you can't get your hands dirty by gardening, tend to your houseplants. Or get your hands dirty by cooking or crafting, or doing something good that occupies your hands and minds and keeps you out of trouble. And that's the last word on 5 daily habits to keep gardening alive all year. I'm Carol Michael. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Garden DC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to anchor.fm/gardendc/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to washingtongardener.com. Thank you. You can find Washington Gardener online at washingtongardener.com, on Twitter at WDC Gardener, on Instagram at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook.com at Washington Gardener Magazine.